morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Our learning this morning is sponsored by Susan and Rabbi Saul Kass to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Yortzeit of Rabbi Kass's mother, Rivka Rachel Bas Vayakhel Zichrono Livracha, and also sponsored by Max and Debbie Rudman in memory of Max's grandfather's Yortzeit, Menachem Chanina ben Moshe Zichrono Livracha. The Neshamos should have aliyos. Thank you to both families. Okay, beginning with chapter 35, verse 2. So Moshe Rabbeinu has gathered the Jewish people together, and we know that this is going to be all about the Mishkan, but really interestingly, the first thing he tells them is not the Mishkan. He says to them, Sheishes yamim te'aseh melacha, for 6 days work will be done. Uvayom hashviyi yeh lachem kodesh, Shabbat Shabbason Hashem, on the seventh day is holy. It's the Shabbos to God. Kol ha'osevo melacha yumas. Anyone who does a prohibited labor on that day will die. He says a specific thing about not lighting fires. And then in verse 4, Moshe says, this is what God commands. And he says, start bringing donations for the Mishkan. So the question, of course, begs to be asked, why in the world? He's told them about Shabbos. Why does he have to tell them about Shabbos again? Why is he telling them about Shabbos here? So if you glance over at Rashi on Pasuk Beis, Sheishes Yamim, Hiktim Lohem Ashara Shabbos Tzivui Melechas HaMishkan. We precede the instructions regarding the building of the Mishkan with a reminder about Shabbos. Lomar she'eno doche es haShabbos. A really interesting lesson that despite the great importance and centrality of the building of the Mishkan in the Jewish existence in the desert, it doesn't override Shabbos. So work very hard to build the Mishkan, but when Shabbos comes, like Mrs. Sperling, sometimes you have to put out the cigar. Sometimes you have to stop working on the Mishkan. Okay, it's a really interesting kliyakar on this pasuk. Kliyakar pasuk beis sheishes yamim tiasem melacha, for 6 days work will be done. Piresh Rashi hikdim lohem as hara Shabbos with sivui melechas hamishkan. Rashi says that God puts the instruction of Shabbos before the instruction of the Mishkan. Lomar she'enu docha Shabbos, to show Shabbos comes first. So we're not just learning, presumably we're not just learning from the juxtaposition of Shabbos to the Mishkan, but the specific sequence. Shabbos is mentioned before Mishkan. That means Shabbos is more important. Umakshim kan, so the Kliyakar says there are those who ask the question over here. Valo b'parshas kedoshim ksiv ishimova aviv tira'u v'shabsosai tishmoru. So let me ask you a question. Let's say a person's parent told them, you're supposed to honor me. I want you to give me a ride somewhere on Shabbos. So let's say we know the lesson. The lesson is that Shabbos comes first, right? Okay, well, here's the problem. The sequence of the psukim over there's a juxtaposition there too, but the first one is honoring one's parents. So if we apply the same logical model that was applied to our psukim, we would say, well, it talks about honoring one's parents first, so that trumps Shabbos, because that's what we said over here. It talks about Shabbos before the Mishkan. It's a pretty good question. How does that work out? So again, Rashi says the famous idea that if your parent tells you to desecrate the Shabbos, don't listen. V'sham lo hiktim Shabbos. It doesn't say Shabbos first over there. It says Shabbos second. And yet we say that Shabbos trumps honoring one's parents. So over here, Rashi says the whole point is because it says Shabbos first. Well, that doesn't work out well with the whole thing with honoring one's parents, which is followed by Shabbos. How does that work? Nearest low kashamid, he says the kliyakar, it would appear it's not a difficult point. Kisham diek medichsev as shabsosai tishmoru lashon rabim vayalo lomar tishmor shariah pasuk maska b'lashon yachid shnam rishim of yavutiro rotzolomar kol ish veish. He has a really good shot. So he says, let's think about the pasuk. It says, ishimo v'yavutiro. A person should honor their parents. It's in the singular. Ish. It doesn't say anoshim. It says ish. One person. And then the next phrase says v'yashabsosai tishmoru. And you in the plural should observe my Shabbos. And what that implies, saying it in the plural, is it implies all of you should observe my Shabbos. And actually, if you think about the language of the famous lesson over there, it's that type of language. You're all obligated in Shabbos. So that's a different lesson. The lesson over there is not from the sequence. The lesson over there is that we shift from singular to plural, implying that your parents are also obligated in Shabbos. So therefore, they're not entitled to tell you to not observe the Shabbos. Okay, so now we guess a little bit. Okay, so I think we've seen enough of the point, but whereas here, the only nuance is the order of things. So in our context, we learn from the sequence, and in that context, we learn from the shift from the singular to the plural. Just an interesting pshat. Okay, let's go on to verse 5. Kechu meitchem truma l'Hashem. Take from yourselves offerings to God, kol nedivibo, every one of generosity of heart. Yiviyah etz trumas Hashem should bring this offering to God. Sahav v'chesed v'choshes, gold, silver, copper, and we go through these things. There's a very famous question. It could be asked in Parshas Truma as well. I don't know if we discussed it at the time, but I don't think we discussed these commentaries. So we'll go for it. Why does it say take? Why does it say take a donation? Forgive the aside. I was recently at an institution's dinner, and a week or two ago, one of the honorees said, there's this famous question. Why does it say take a donation? Why does it say that? This question should say give a donation. He said, once I met the director of fundraising from this institution, I understand the pshat, because he decided how much I was going to give. So he took my donation. So I thought that was a pretty good line. So Sforno on Pasuk Hey, Kechume Itchem, is a very novel pshat from the Sforno. The standard thing that's said is when one gives a donation to the Mishkan, one is really benefiting from it. One is getting more than they're giving, a famous idea. Sforno says, Kechume Itchem, Atem Bacharu Anoshim, Hashem. You know what the taking is? You need to take people, or better said, appoint people to be the gabais, the treasurers, to make the collections. So the taking, says the Sforno, is not on the actual donation. The taking is on appointing the treasurer, or the collector. Just an interesting shot. But now I'd like to see the Kli Yakar. Kli Yakar on Pasuk Kechu meitchem truma l'Hashem. Kfar pirash l'mala shemeitchem b'alahotzi asagaza. We actually discussed this point yesterday. The Kli Yakar says, the reason why it says take from yourselves is make sure it's yours. Remember, we had this yesterday. The Kli Yakar said that Moshe not only told them about donations to the Mishkan, Moshe also told them that he wanted to have court cases to make sure that everyone correctly had what they had, and there weren't all disputes were resolved. So make sure that if you make a donation to the Mishkan, that it's yours. But there's another point learned from you, says the Kli Yakar. Shekel echad yizdares l'mitzvah me'atzmo. Everyone should be internally inspired to perform this mitzvah. Ki yesh lecha adam she'enu nosein klum ad sheroa acherim nostim miskane b'hem. There are people who aren't inclined to give. But then, you see other people give. You say, oh, wow, that looks like a nice thing to do. Whether it be you're inspired by them, whether it be you feel social pressure, whether it be you're jealous of the acclaim that they received, or any combination of the above. But many times we're inspired to do something good because somebody else did it. Okay, no saying lahem. So now I need to keep up with the Schwartzes, right? So that you gave, so now I needed to give. Kli Yakar says that would not be giving from yourself. It might be your money, but it wouldn't be from you. The inspiration is not internal. The inspiration is from other people. The Kli Yakar says what we mean when we say from you is from your own move, from your own inspiration to do. The Yeshon, there are those who say that it really means from you. That God says that if you give with generosity, In God's mind, it's as if you gave up yourself. Because it's not an easy thing to make a donation. It'd be more fun to have it for yourself. And God sees the beauty of that. Imagine a person who is very difficult to give, and they give up because they have very little, and they give, it's like they're giving of their own flesh. So this is an interesting idea from the Kli Yakar about deeper meanings in giving from yourself. A few different ideas. Okay, let's go on now to verse 21. Verse 21. So Moshe gives these instructions, and so now people have their marching orders. So now people need to go home and figure out what they want to give, and come back to Moshe. So verse 21, Vayavo kol ish asher nisa'o libo, and every person whose heart raised him came. V'chol asher nadva rucho also, and every person whose spirit moved him to generosity came. Hevias trumas Hashem l'mlechas ol moed. They brought the donation of God for the work in the tent of meeting, l'chol avodaso, and for all of the work, l'vigdei hakodesh, and for the sacred garments. Okay, so the point is, people who are ready to make donations came to make the donations. Very, very nice idea. There are two describers here. There are two descriptions here. One is the person whose heart elevated him. One is the person whose spirit moved him. What's the difference? Sounds extremely redundant. Are these two different groups of people? Are these two different aspects of the same people? What is this? Ramban on Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Vayavo kol ish asher nisa'o libo. Ala chacham ma'osim b'melacha yomar kain. This first group, the ones whose heart elevated them, are not donors. That's the second group. The first group are the people who came to work, to do. Kilo matzinu al hamisnadvim nisius slave. We don't see this language of being elevated by one's heart by the donors. The language used by the donors is generosity, and that, of course, is appropriate. So what is meant when it says the person whose heart elevated him? To come to work. None of these people took courses in this stuff. None of these people had been appropriately trained in working with metals and weaving. And are you kidding? They were doing hard labor in Egypt. By any other klal, or a person who had unique talents to do this or that. Of a matzah b'tivo, sheyad alasos came. People had to look deep within themselves and kind of get an inkling that they had an ability to do such a thing. V'yigba libo b'darchei Hashem. And then a person needs to be elevated by one's heart in the ways of God. Lavo lifnei Moshe, to come before Moshe. Lemor lo ani ese kol asher Adoni dover. To walk up to Moshe Rabbeinu and say, "Yeah, I'm ready to do this. Just tell me where to start. I'll work on the silver. I'll work on the wool." It's a fascinating shot in the Ramban. The Ramban is saying that this is not a knock on donors. Donors, the Torah says that they had a spirit of generosity. That's amazing. But the Ramban is highlighting the remarkable courage that was necessary for a person to come forward and volunteer to work. Who knew that they knew what they were doing? But a person just thought they could do it and they wanted to do it. Just imagine, by the way, you come and you volunteer and you mess up. Could you imagine how embarrassing that would be? You know, your friend from down the street donated that, whatever, and you didn't know what in the world you were doing. And you totally broke the thing. It's awkward. But that was the only way this was going to happen. People who didn't have prior experience came to do it. So the Ramban says a person who came to do it was elevated by their heart to have the courage. I just think it's a really, really interesting shot. So we discussed this morning the Kli Yakar regarding the difference between the juxtaposition of Shabbos and the Mishkan and honoring one's parents in Shabbos. We discussed the Sforno regarding taking donations. We discussed the Kli Yakar regarding giving donations from oneself, what that meant. We discussed the Ramban regarding what it meant to be elevated by one's heart.